Hey guys, welcome to day 4. This is going to be a pretty big, pretty exciting lesson. So I'm really excited to dig in deeper with advanced CSS styling. I know this is something that you've been super excited about from the comments in the Facebook community. It's going to be a pretty big lesson, so don't be afraid to hit pause, rewatch some sessions, pause and play with it in CodePen, take some notes. Remember that coding is a language, so don't beat yourself up if you don't memorize everything off the top of your head the first time. That's not really how this works. If you can broadly wrap your head around what I'm explaining and then put effort into practicing those skills so you start to remember them, closer to off the top of your head, then that is amazing. So let's dig in. What we're going to look at first, I'm going to go over a quick recap on what we've learnt so far, just to get our bearings for what we're about to learn. Then we're going to look at structural HTML, so how we can create container elements in HTML. We'll look at classes that let us get more specific with our styling, the basics of specificity and what happens with CSS when we have multiple conflicting styles, and then a light and dark section activity. All right, so first let's jump over to see what we've learned on CodePen. So we've got our CodePen here. I'll just make it a little bit smaller so it fits the screen. And let's do a recap of what we've learned so far. So first we learned some HTML elements. These create the structure of the page. So things like H1, which is our top level heading. We usually only have one of those. H2. H2s are our next level of heading, and we can have multiple of those on the page. H3. Now, some common mistakes you guys made that I saw in the Facebook group is forgetting to close one. Now, when I first do that, nothing seems to have changed. So you could be forgiven for thinking that it wasn't actually necessary or it didn't actually break something. But if we were to look at what's happening behind the scenes, the browser thinks this H2 is still open. So this H3 is actually part of this H2. And if I tried to style that H2, let's see what results we get. Okay, so in this case, it's clever enough to recognize that we haven't wanted this H3 to be styled as well, but sometimes you can get unexpected results when you haven't closed elements, especially when you get into padding and margin. So just double check each one you have opened and closed. And when you click on each one, it'll actually underline the corresponding pair. Then we learned paragraphs, and if you type LOREM and hit tab, it should auto-generate a paragraph for you. And that was the basis of our HTML and links. So I've got a space href. We put the URL that we want, and you can just copy this, and then the text that we want to display. So that was the basics of what we learned so far for HTML. Then in CSS, we've got a new syntax. So we've got our element selector that says which element we want to style, a set of open and closed curly brackets, the property name and the property value. And when we want to do multiple styles, we just pop down here and we can add more. Cool? So that's what we've done so far. So let's tab back to the last screen. All right, let's recap. We just recapped what we've learnt so far in CodePen. The next thing we want to get onto is HTML structure. So when we're building a website, we need more than just a collection of individual elements. You can imagine our pages would be pretty boring if all we had was individual text elements that sat on top of each other. To resolve that, we have container elements. So container elements give structure to our page. When we just add one, on its own, adding a container element won't necessarily make any difference to how the page looks or feels, but it gives us another element that we can group other individual elements and that we can style. And some of the most common ones are header, section, footer, and div. So header is usually the first element on the page that contains everything that you would think of as being in the header of a website. Footer contains the footer. Section is how we break up other big blocks of content on the page. And for anything that that one of those other options doesn't really apply, maybe it's purely stylistic and it's not actually organizing content on our page, then we use div. And div just stands for division. Technically, each of these things does exactly the same thing. So you won't break your website by using a div where you should have used a section, or using a section instead of a footer. It's more to be semantically accurate, so to be as accurate as possible in how you're coding the website, and that can have benefits both for SEO and for yourself. When you're reading through your code and you see header, section, footer, you intrinsically know what you're looking at. Whereas if you just saw div, 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 it can get a little bit confusing. So this might be what your page looks like. You might have a header at the top, a footer at the bottom, a couple of sections. Inside some of your sections, you might still need containers to wrap other blocks of content. So maybe you've got 3 columns in the first section, maybe you've got 2 columns in the second section. So this kind of layout is pretty common. The main way we use container elements is to put other things inside them. That's why it's a container. So for example, we create a header. Inside the header, we put a H1 and a paragraph. Or as you've done before, we have a paragraph, we can nest inside an element like a link inside it. So whenever we put one element inside another, we call that nesting. Where container elements get interesting is once we've written the HTML, we can use CSS to style them together. So let's try that in CodePen. So let's jump over to CodePen. I will get rid of some of this. Let's make it small enough that we can see it. So I've just got a H3 and a paragraph. Now at the moment, if I wanted to give both of these a shared background, I would have to target each one at a time. So I would target the H3 and then I would target the paragraph. But instead, if I were to wrap them in a section, so if I were to put an open section tag at the top and a close section tag at the bottom, then in my CSS, I can target my section and say, let's have a background color of orange. Then I can target both elements at once. And this is going to make our CSS styling much more efficient. I can give it some padding, and that will go all the way around the inside of the element. Now, if you were to write your HTML like this, all in one line, it starts to get pretty confusing. It's hard to tell where one element starts and the next one finishes. Because if you were reading this, you've opened your section, but then it doesn't close. So what we do with HTML, whenever we are nesting elements inside of each other, we select them all and hit tab. And we want to indent them in. And that won't have any practical effect on the coding. The browser still interprets it exactly the same way, but just like we organize our CSS by laying it out on specific lines, by indenting in our HTML, it makes it a lot easier to see, okay, my H3 and my paragraph are inside my section. I can see when my section opens and closes. So any styles that we wanted to apply to both, a lot of them we can do in this one selector. So we could make the color green, and that would apply to both. Now, this is the part that I know you guys are most excited about. What we've learned so far is our element selector. So we use an element name like P, H1, H2, section, and then we put double curly brackets and we write the styles. And what that does is styles every paragraph on the page. But what we haven't learnt yet is what to do if we want to style just some of the paragraphs. And predictably, this is the question I get most often when people start coding is, oh, I'm so excited about changing everything. How do I get more focused, more specific about the way that I'm doing this? As our websites get more complex, our styles need to get more specific. And to do that, we have something called classes. And this is how they work. Class selectors allow us to categorize sets of elements and then style them separately from other elements. So in our HTML, we add a class inside the open tag. So just like we did with our href, which is an attribute for links, class is an attribute that we can add to any element that lets us group and style them together. So here I've got 2 paragraphs, and one of my paragraphs I've given a class of alert. So class equals, in quotes, alert. If I want to target that paragraph specifically, or any element with a class of alert, in my CSS I use a dot, and the dot is our class selector. It says, hey, I'm about to look for a class name, not a paragraph, not an element name. So we're now looking in our CSS to say find every element with a class of alert and then apply these styles. Let's try that. So we jump back over to CodePen. I'll make it really simple. I'll have 2 H3s. All right, so I've got 2 H3s and I want to target just one of them. So what I'm going to do is add a class to one of my H3s. And you can use any word you want for classes. I could call it pumpkin or fancy title. You just want it to be as descriptive as possible so that it's easy to understand. So let's say class equals alert. And then in our CSS, to target that one specifically, if I used my H3 selector and said color red, both of them would be red because they're both H3s. If I used in my CSS dot alert, then only the second one, only the one with a class of alert is going to be highlighted. Pretty cool? So with classes, we can create multiple classes. So we could create a class of big text and then say dot big text. Spell it correctly. Font size 2 rem. You can also apply one class to multiple elements. So if I were to target this first one and say class equals big text, then you can see how modular it becomes. So we get to group and categorize specific HTML elements and style them together. Now it doesn't have to be the same element. If I created a P with a class of alert, it would still apply those same styles because this selector it's not opinionated about what kind of element you are, it's opinionated about whether you have this class. So if you have a class of alert, it'll apply the color red. If you have a class of big text, it'll apply a font size of 2 rems. And you can mix and match various classes to create the design that you want. People have different opinions. Some people make lots of classes and have a specific class for, lots of different elements that they want to style. Other people try to be more modular in their classes, so they put just 1 or 2 styles under each class and add multiple classes. There isn't really a right or wrong way of doing it. What's more important when you're first starting out is just wrapping your head around the whole concept. Cool? So here is another example. We've got 2 paragraphs and a link, and we say a class of alert on our paragraph and our link. In the CSS, we make a class selector by using a dot, select everything with a class of alert and make the color red, and that will target both of those elements. Now, what happens if we were to create multiple conflicting styles? Because so far we've just done really simple styles. We've written one style for each element. But in the example before, we had intentionally created two separate styles that might apply. So we said make all paragraphs blue. And then you say, but actually make this one paragraph red. So for that second paragraph, it's receiving two rules. It's saying it's a paragraph, so it should be red. And it's saying we've targeted this specific one and it should be blue. CSS has rules to understand which styles to apply when there's conflicting CSS rules written. This can get a little bit complicated. Feel free to screenshot this, or I'll save it in the notes and you can come back to it. But there's two main ways that it cascades, that it applies the rules. First, it reads from top to bottom. So if you're using the same selector, if you're using, say, an element selector, and you write a color blue, and then further down your CSS sheet, you forget that you've written that, and then say a color red, it would be red. So it's read one rule and applied it. It keeps reading down the page, reads a new rule, and then writes that over the top. Now, if we actually want it to override, that's where we start to get more specific and use classes. So if you have an element selector and a class selector both being applied, it's the class selector that will take precedence. So classes are more specific than element names. So if you've got a conflicting style, in this case the color, it will base it off which one is using a class. Make sense? As you get into more complicated selectors, these are only 2 of the maybe 10 different kinds of CSS selectors that we teach in the bootcamp. As you get more complicated, there's a few more rules to it, but at a beginner level, it reads top to bottom and more specific to less specific. Okay, first activity of the day. So feel free to pause the lesson here and come back after. Maybe I'll even pause it. We're going to, in our HTML, create 2 H2s, 2 H3s, 2 paragraphs, write a default style for each, and then create 3 classes in your CSS and experiment by adding those classes to your various HTML elements and watch them override the default styles. So we're learning that specificity by practicing it. Start there, and then I'll record the second video for part 2.